Hi everyone, in this presentation we're going to talk about the concept of pedagogical content knowledge. This is a concept derived from research into how teachers link their knowledge of subject areas with their skills of how to teach. It is very influential in the fields of teacher education, professional development, and in your standards that you're expected to meet for teaching. So Lee Shulman, back in the mid-1980s, this is quoting from a 1987 piece, identified 7 categories of essential knowledge for teachers. One category is content knowledge. If you're an English teacher, content knowledge would be general education studies content knowledge, grammar, literature, writing, composition, and so forth. There's general pedagogical knowledge. That's your general knowledge of teaching. Pedagogical content knowledge, as we'll discuss in much greater detail later on in this presentation, consists of a combination. It's basically a bridge between content knowledge and your knowledge of teaching. So basically a combination of overall content knowledge with teaching practices. Curriculum knowledge is, of course, your knowledge of curriculum studies, your knowledge of how we plan the path for teaching, how we plan lesson plans, for instance. What does curriculum consist of? Knowledge of educational context, that of course would be knowledge of the education environment, how a learning environment can affect student learning. Knowledge of learners and their characteristics, that's learning theory, that's psychology of students, that's educational psychology, for example. Knowledge of educational goals. This goes into lesson planning, your objectives and your goals that you write in your lesson plans. Why do we teach something? How do we formulate a learning goal for students, for example? That's what we mean by educational goals. And I'm sure you can see that these 7 categories are very influential to this day. They form a kind of nexus that wields our expectations of teachers together. So when we talk about content knowledge, it is the teacher's knowledge of the subject matter that students will learn. If you're going to be a social studies teacher, content knowledge is your knowledge of broad field social studies. If you are an undergraduate, or in some cases a master's student in one of my classes, and you're preparing to take the content knowledge portion of your certification exam, of course, this is what we mean by that. Now, controversially, if you look back at this slide, you'll notice that content knowledge is really only one of 7 categories that are widely considered essential knowledge for teachers. And now, when you take your certification exams, if you live in Missouri or Arkansas, your certification exam these days primarily consists of content knowledge. We're not really testing you that much for certification exam purposes these days on these other 6 categories. If you were to get into the student teaching, that's where these other 6 categories come in. Nationwide, there's the EdTPA, Educational Teacher Practice Assessment, that deals with these other 6 categories. The EdTPA, of course, has a variety of other controversies. Not everyone is a fan of how that test is being administered and implemented and assessed. Anytime we talk about nationwide or statewide testing of these categories, because these categories are very context specific, and because the practice of teaching is very context specific, it can be hard to assess. But now, on the other hand, Shulman would argue that teaching needs to be viewed as a specialized practice, a very professional practice, along the lines of the other professions that require certifications. And that goal of his, that belief of his, was one reason why he developed the concept of pedagogical content knowledge in the first place. So when we talk about content knowledge, it includes the following: knowledge of concepts. For instance, in English studies, if you're taking your exam to be an English teacher, knowledge of concepts of literature, literary criticism, theories related to the field, the ideas within your field, key ideas within literary studies, key ideas of grammar, organizational framework of that particular content that you're going to teach, evidence and proof that you do have this level of knowledge, practices that are in place within your field. That's what's supposed to be content knowledge. The bottom line is, of course, how can you teach something that you don't know? We get into pedagogical knowledge then. Pedagogical knowledge is your understanding of the processes as well as practices and methods of teaching and how students learn. This includes understanding the nature of the students, that's their psychological nature as well as cognitive. How does the affective component, if we're going to deal with Bloom's taxonomy, how does the affective component interact with the cognitive component as well as the psychomotor? All of this goes into pedagogical knowledge. Having strategies for evaluating the students, that's of course your assessment strategies that we talk about. Understanding of cognitive, social, and developmental theories of learning and how they can then be applied into your decision making as a teacher. All of this goes into pedagogical knowledge. Next, we get into the subject of this presentation. That's pedagogical content knowledge, sometimes abbreviated as PCK, of course. Pedagogical content knowledge is knowing what, when, why, and how to teach using knowledge of good teaching practices as well as your personal experience as a teacher. Now, that last category, of course, shows you that pedagogical content knowledge is continuously evolving for you throughout your career as a teacher as you gain more experience. Pedagogical content knowledge is basically the accumulation of the following things: your knowledge of the subject matter that you teach, your knowledge of the students, as well as your disavowing yourself of possible misconceptions related to your students, such as stereotypes, prejudices, knowledge of the curricula and how to apply that curricula, as well as knowledge of general teaching practices, in other words, pedagogy. Experience makes a major difference when we talk about pedagogical content knowledge. PCK, pedagogical content knowledge, is basically saying that we recognize there is a distinction between declarative knowledge and procedural knowledge. Declarative knowledge meaning I know that something is believed in the field of education. I know that we believe in certain things about how to teach, or for instance, direct instructional practices or cooperative learning. I know something about that. Procedural knowledge is I know how to apply that in action, and that comes with experience. That comes with practice. There's a big difference. For instance, you can study in your teacher education classes all you want about proper techniques of direct instruction, proper techniques of cooperative learning, proper techniques of doing a think aloud or scaffolding procedures. But until you have actually applied that in practice as a working teacher, that's nothing but declarative knowledge until it becomes procedural. And it takes time, it takes practice for procedural knowledge to grow. PCK focuses on understanding how knowledge is related to pedagogical decision making. There are some key elements to pedagogical content knowledge. We have to know the knowledge of representations of your subject matter. In other words, you have to know your content knowledge related to English studies or social studies or science. Now, when you take your test, of course, for your certification, these tests tend to be broad. For instance, with social studies, that's a very broad test, encapsulating economics, political science, concepts in social studies, including civics and so forth. It's very broad. Many students tend to struggle with that. But the basic underlying assumption here is that if you lack a broad knowledge and a broad representation of the subject matter that you're potentially going to teach once you're certified, then you're not going to be a very effective teacher. Content knowledge does matter. Next, we think about the understanding of students' conceptions of the subject and learning and how this impacts your teaching. In other words, you have to understand how your students make meaning. We have to understand the affective, psychomotor, and the cognitive aspects of student learning. Next, we have to get into general pedagogical knowledge, or in other words, teaching strategies. How do you implement cooperative learning? What are some good techniques that you want to use? What are some good techniques for direct instruction instead of just getting up there and rambling? Teaching has to be very strategic. Then we get into curriculum knowledge. For those of you that take certain classes with me, many of my classes, I tend to get you very deeply into curriculum. And of course, as you know, there are different theories of curriculum. Some theories, roughly called social efficiency, mean that you want to prepare your students directly for application in their careers. If you are more pragmatic, John Dewey, for instance, then the goal of curriculum is to have reflective thinking so that you can then also put it in real life practice. If you are more of a meliorist or critical theory oriented, part of the goal of curriculum includes transformation of society and thinking about what's wrong in society so that students can then contribute to making society more just, more equitable. If you're more of a humanist, then the ultimate goal of curriculum is, of course, to help students reach their maximum potential of their skills and human qualities so that eventually you reach self actualization. So, again, the goals of curriculum, you've got different people that have disagreements about what is the overall goal of the curriculum. You can think of the curriculum as basically the path that students travel, and it takes careful planning to guide this curriculum in a way so that students meet their learning goals and other goals that you want to set. Then we get into knowledge of educational contexts. That's the learning environment, the classroom environment, the school setting, the overall context in which learning is taking place. And knowing the importance of taking in context, because what works in one context might not work as well in another context. Then there is, of course, knowledge of the purposes and goals of education, like we were just talking about with all of these ideological debates that we have about what is education, what are the goals of education, what are the goals of the curriculum. So we get into understanding what we mean by pedagogical content knowledge. This is that bridge between your knowledge of pedagogy and your knowledge of your content. PCK, pedagogical knowledge, includes both theory learned during your teacher preparation as well as your experiences as a classroom teacher. Schulman defined pedagogical content knowledge as following: the blending of content and pedagogy into an understanding of how particular topics, problems, or issues are organized, represented, and adapted to the diverse interests and abilities of learners and presented for instruction. Let's break that down for a second. Notice you've got to have knowledge of your content, like we were just talking. You've got to have knowledge of your teaching practices, your pedagogy. You have to have knowledge of the topics you're discussing, how to analyze problems that you might encounter, issues that you might encounter in your teaching decision making, knowledge of your learners, knowledge of how to diversify instruction. That's a lot, isn't it? Pedagogical content knowledge is very much influenced by personal background, your background experiences. Always, when you're forming new knowledge is linked with old knowledge for yourself as well as for your students. So, background always matters. It's influenced by the context of the teaching experiences. And it's also influenced by the context of the training that you receive, both during your teacher education program as well as your professional development. Knowledge of the craft of teaching is basically what we're talking about when we talk about pedagogical content knowledge. Pedagogy, knowledge of pedagogy, knowledge of students, knowledge of the subject matter that you're teaching, and knowledge of the curriculum and how to tie these together. That's what we mean by pedagogical content knowledge, and it is key to being an effective teacher, according to this approach. There are some key implications I want you to keep in mind here. Pedagogical content knowledge is thought to drive much of teacher decision making in your educational choices. Pedagogical content knowledge links knowledge about teaching with knowledge about how students learn. Pedagogical content knowledge, basically, we're talking about the teacher's interpretations and applications of subject matter knowledge in the context of facilitating actual student learning. It's that bridge there. PCK, pedagogical content knowledge, is thought to be the key to distinguishing the knowledge base of teaching. It's basically the intersection of content and pedagogy. We also get into some areas of concern in the literature about this. For instance, we're still exploring how the concept of pedagogical content knowledge relates to second language learners. How does PCK relate to culturally responsive pedagogy, as understood by the likes of Ladson Billings and Slater and Geneva Gay? Whether pedagogical content knowledge adequately considers equity and social justice concerns. And there's a wide swath of research about how to factor in technology in with pedagogical content knowledge. And in another presentation, I'll talk with you about some of those efforts in what's called technological pedagogical content knowledge. Okay, so hopefully you enjoyed this. Hopefully it was worthwhile to you. And I'll talk to you later. Bye.